The spring air filled Washington Park with a sense of renewal. Children played on the swings while joggers followed the winding paths between blooming cherry trees. Among them was Thomas Johnson, a 42-year-old man who had come to enjoy his lunch break in peace. Thomas sat on a bench, unwrapping his sandwich while watching ducks glide across the small pond. At 6 feet 2 inches with broad shoulders and dark skin, he had an imposing presence that belied his gentle nature. He wore simple clothes, khaki pants and a navy blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and kept to himself, occasionally checking his phone. Officer Richard Miller patrolled the park that afternoon as part of his regular beat. At 38, he'd been with the police department for nearly 15 years, developing habits and assumptions that colored his view of the world. His thinning hair and perpetual frown made him look older than his years. As he scanned the park, his eyes locked onto Thomas. Something about Thomas bothered Officer Miller. Perhaps it was how Thomas kept looking at his watch, or how he seemed to be watching the children play. Whatever the reason, Miller's suspicion grew with each passing minute. He'd dealt with troublemakers in the park before, drug dealers using the family-friendly environment as cover for their activities. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Miller said as he approached Thomas. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Thomas looked up, surprised. "Just having lunch," he replied calmly, gesturing to his half-eaten sandwich. "My office is just down the street." Officer Miller's eyes narrowed. "I've been watching you. You seem pretty interested in those kids over there." Thomas followed Miller's gaze toward the playground. "I wasn't watching the children," he explained. "I was just enjoying being outside. It's a beautiful day. Can I see some ID?" Miller asked, his hand resting casually near his holster. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, that same sensation he'd experienced countless times before when unfairly singled out. He considered explaining that he was actually watching the ducks, not the children. He thought about mentioning that he was a father himself. But experience had taught him to stay calm and compliant. "I don't understand why you need my ID. I'm just sitting here eating lunch," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification," Miller insisted, his tone hardening. "It's just a routine check." People nearby began to notice the interaction. A young woman walking her dog slowed her pace, watching with concern. An elderly couple on a nearby bench whispered to each other. Thomas felt their eyes on him, felt the situation slipping beyond his control. "I have the right to be here," Thomas said, his lunch forgotten. "I haven't done anything wrong." Officer Miller stepped closer. "Are you refusing to comply, sir?" Thomas knew he had a choice to make. He could continue to resist what he knew was an unjust demand, or he could comply to avoid escalation. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached for his wallet. "Here," he said, handing over his driver's license. "But I want you to know I don't appreciate being harassed while I'm just trying to eat my lunch." Officer Miller examined the ID, his expression unchanging. "Wait here," he said, walking a few steps away to radio in the information. As he waited, Thomas noticed more people watching. A man had taken out his phone and appeared to be recording the interaction. Thomas felt humiliation wash over him, but also a spark of hope that at least there would be a record of this incident. Miller returned, his demeanor slightly different. "Where did you say you work, Mr. Johnson?" "I didn't," Thomas replied. "But I work at Franklin Medical Center. I'm the head of cardiology there." A flicker of surprise crossed Miller's face, but he quickly composed himself. "A doctor, huh? What's a doctor doing hanging around a park in the middle of a workday?" Thomas took a deep breath. "As I told you, I'm on my lunch break. The hospital is 2 blocks away. I come here often when the weather is nice." Near the playground, a woman had been watching the interaction while her daughter played on the swings. She approached cautiously. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, looking between Thomas and Officer Miller. "Everything's fine, ma'am," Miller replied curtly. "Just conducting routine police business." "He hasn't done anything," the woman said. "He sits on that same bench almost every day. Sometimes we chat about his kids and mine." Thomas recognized her as Rachel, a regular at the park whose daughter attended the same school as his son. He nodded gratefully at her. Officer Miller seemed momentarily thrown off balance. He handed the ID back to Thomas but didn't apologize. "Just doing my job," he said. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area." "What kind of suspicious activity involves eating a sandwich?" Rachel asked, not backing down. Other onlookers had gathered now. The man with the phone was still recording. Officer Miller's radio crackled, and he stepped away to answer it, turning his back to the growing crowd. Thomas remained seated, his appetite gone, the sandwich sitting forgotten beside him. He'd experienced this kind of treatment before, but that didn't make it any easier. Each time felt like the first, the same shock, the same anger, the same careful control he needed to maintain. When Miller returned, his face had lost some of its sternness. "You're free to go, Dr. Johnson," he said, emphasizing the title in a way that sounded almost sarcastic. "Enjoy your lunch." As Miller walked away, Rachel sat down beside Thomas. "Are you okay?" she asked. Thomas nodded, though they both knew it wasn't true. "This isn't the first time," he said quietly. "And it probably won't be the last." What neither Thomas nor Officer Miller realized was that the incident had already begun spreading beyond the park. The man recording had uploaded the video to social media, where it was quickly gaining attention. And Thomas Johnson wasn't just any doctor, he was one of the most respected cardiologists in the state, a man who had saved countless lives, including the life of the police commissioner's wife just 6 months earlier. The story was just beginning to unfold. By evening, the video of Thomas's encounter with Officer Miller had been viewed over 50,000 times. Hashtags demanding justice spread across social media platforms, and local news stations began reaching out to both the police department and Franklin Medical Center for comments. Thomas returned to work that afternoon, trying to focus on his patients despite the churning in his stomach. He hadn't told anyone at the hospital about the incident, preferring to keep his professional and personal struggles separate. But as he finished his last consultation of the day, his phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. "Dr. Johnson?" His assistant, Lily, knocked on his office door. "The chief of surgery wants to see you. He says it's urgent." Thomas sighed, wondering if someone at the hospital had seen the video. "Tell him I'll be right there." In the police station across town, Officer Miller was being called into Captain Reynolds' office. The captain, a stern woman with 25 years on the force, motioned for Miller to close the door. "Sit down, Miller," she said, turning her computer screen toward him. "Care to explain this?" Miller watched himself on the screen, confronting Thomas in the park. From this angle, with the sound of concerned murmurs from onlookers, his actions looked worse than he remembered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was a routine check, Captain. We've had reports of drug activity in that park." Captain Reynolds paused the video. "Drug activity? And what made you suspect this particular man?" Miller hesitated. He was acting suspicious. Watching the playground, checking his watch. He was eating lunch, Miller. And according to his statement, he was watching ducks on the pond. Reynolds tapped her desk impatiently. "Do you know who Thomas Johnson is?" "Some doctor," Miller replied, shrugging. "Not just some doctor. Dr. Thomas Johnson is the head of cardiology at Franklin Medical Center. He pioneered a new technique for valve replacement that's saved hundreds of lives. He serves on the hospital's board of directors." She leaned forward. "And 6 months ago, he performed emergency surgery on Commissioner Walsh's wife when she had a heart attack. He saved her life." Miller's face paled. I didn't know. Clearly, Reynolds said. The commissioner called me personally about this. The video has over 100,000 views now. People are calling for your badge. Meanwhile, Thomas sat across from Dr. Alan Peterson, the chief of surgery and his longtime friend. I saw the video, Thomas, Alan said, his voice gentle. Are you okay? Thomas looked down at his hands. I'm fine. It's nothing I haven't dealt with before. That's what concerns me, Alan replied. The fact that this happens to you at all is unacceptable. The fact that it happens repeatedly. He shook his head. The hospital has issued a statement supporting you. The board wants to meet with you tomorrow. Thomas looked up, surprised. I don't want to make this a bigger deal than it is. It already is a big deal, Alan said, sliding his tablet across the desk. Look. Thomas scrolled through news articles featuring his face alongside headlines about racial profiling. There were statements from civil rights organizations, interviews with witnesses from the park, and a growing outcry for police accountability. This isn't just about you anymore, Alan explained. You've become a symbol of something much larger. That night, Thomas sat with his wife, Lisa, at their kitchen table after putting their 2 children to bed. Lisa held his hand tightly as they watched more coverage of the incident. The police department has placed Officer Richard Miller on administrative leave pending an investigation, the news anchor announced. Commissioner Walsh has issued a statement condemning the officer's actions and has personally reached out to Dr. Johnson to apologize. Lisa turned to Thomas. Have you heard from him? Thomas nodded. He left a message. Wants to meet tomorrow. What are you going to do? She asked. Thomas stared at his reflection in the dark window. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to let it go, to just move on like I always have. But another part wants to fight, Lisa finished for him. You should. Not just for yourself, but for others who don't have your platform. For our children. Thomas's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hello? Dr. Johnson? This is Rachel from the park. I'm sorry to call so late, but I thought you should know, Officer Miller came to my house today. He wanted to talk to me about what happened. Thomas straightened in his chair. What did he say? He asked if I would meet with both of you. He said he wants to apologize in person. After hanging up, Thomas told Lisa about the call. Do you think he's sincere? She asked. I don't know, Thomas replied. But I'm going to find out. Across town, Officer Miller sat alone in his apartment, reading through comments on the viral video. His phone buzzed with a text from his brother, saw you on the news. Mom's upset. Call her. Miller set the phone down without responding. For the first time, he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his actions, and the reckoning that lay ahead. The next morning, Thomas arrived at the community center where Rachel had arranged for him to meet Officer Miller. The building was quiet, with only a few elderly people playing cards in the main hall. Thomas found a small conference room at the end of the corridor, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Officer Miller sat alone at the table, not in uniform but in civilian clothes, a plain gray shirt and jeans. He looked smaller somehow, without his badge and gun. When he saw Thomas, he stood up awkwardly. Dr. Johnson, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Thomas hesitated before shaking Miller's hand. I'm here to listen to what you have to say. They sat across from each other, an uncomfortable silence filling the room until Rachel arrived with 2 cups of coffee. She placed them on the table and took a seat at the end, acting as an informal mediator. Officer Miller, she said, you wanted this meeting. Miller nodded, his eyes fixed on the coffee cup in front of him. What happened in the park? I made assumptions. Wrong assumptions. He looked up at Thomas. I've been a cop for 15 years. I've developed habits, ways of seeing things, people. I thought I was just doing my job. Your job is to protect people, Thomas said quietly. Did I look like someone people needed protection from? Miller didn't answer directly. The department has mandatory training on bias, but it's just something we sit through. Yesterday, after everything blew up, I went back and watched that video a dozen times. I saw myself through everyone else's eyes. Outside the community center, a small crowd of reporters had gathered, tipped off about the meeting. Inside, Thomas listened as Miller continued. I have a nephew about your son's age, Miller said. Last night, I thought about how I'd feel if someone treated him the way I treated you, just because of how he looks. I wouldn't stand for it. Thomas leaned forward. This isn't just about you and me. This happens every day to people who don't have medical degrees, who don't know the police commissioner, who don't get viral videos. What about them? Miller nodded slowly. I know. That's why I'm not fighting the suspension. I deserve it. But I also want to do more than just disappear for a few weeks and come back the same. What are you suggesting? Rachel asked. I want to change things from the inside, Miller replied. I've talked to Captain Reynolds about developing a new training program, one that officers actually take seriously. And I'd like your help, Dr. Johnson. Thomas was surprised. My help? Your perspective. Your experiences. If officers could hear directly from people like you, respected professionals who've been profiled, maybe it would cut through in a way that standard training doesn't. Thomas didn't respond immediately. The proposition was unexpected. He thought about all the times he'd been followed in stores, pulled over for no reason, questioned in places where he had every right to be. I need to think about it, he finally said. Rachel smiled encouragingly. That's fair. As they stood to leave, a reporter spotted them through the window. Camera flashes began to light up the room from outside. The story was about to take another turn. As cameras flashed outside the community center, Thomas instinctively raised his hand to shield his face. This wasn't what he had wanted, more attention, more exposure. He had come here for a private conversation, not a media circus. There's a back exit, Rachel whispered, guiding both men toward a service hallway. They slipped out through the kitchen, avoiding the reporters who had gathered at the front. In the back parking lot, Commissioner Walsh was waiting beside his car. The police commissioner was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the confident posture of someone used to authority. Dr. Johnson, he said, extending his hand. I thought you might need a ride out of here. Thomas glanced at Miller, who looked as surprised as he was by the commissioner's appearance. Sir, Miller began, but Walsh cut him off with a gesture. We'll talk later, Miller. Right now, I'd like a word with Dr. Johnson. Rachel touched Thomas's arm. I'll call you later, she said before walking to her own car. Thomas got into the commissioner's sedan, and they drove away from the community center in silence. After several blocks, Walsh finally spoke. My wife asks about you every time I come home with chest pain from these stressful days. She says, have Dr. Johnson check you out, he's the only one I trust. Thomas nodded, remembering Mrs. Walsh's difficult surgery. She's a fighter. Like you, Walsh said. Most people would have filed a formal complaint by now. Some would be calling for Miller's job or threatening a lawsuit. That's not my style, Thomas replied. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else who might not be as fortunate as I am. Walsh pulled into a small cafe parking lot and turned off the engine. That's why I'm here. I heard about Miller's idea for a training program. I want to support it, make it official, with funding and real teeth. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Why now? This can't be the first incident of its kind in your department. It's not, Walsh admitted. But it's the first one involving someone who saved my wife's life. Sometimes it takes a personal connection to see clearly. Inside the cafe, they continued their conversation over coffee. What Miller did was wrong, Walsh said. But his willingness to acknowledge it and try to change, that's rare. Most officers in his position would be defensive, hiding behind procedure. Thomas stirred his coffee thoughtfully. One officer changing doesn't fix a broken system. No, Walsh agreed. But it's a start. And with your involvement, it could be more than that. You have credibility both in the community and with my officers. Thomas thought about Lisa's words from the night before, about fighting not just for himself, but for others. For their children. If I do this, he said slowly, I want complete honesty. About the department's history, about the complaints that have been filed before, about what happens to officers who profile people. Walsh nodded. Transparency. I can work with that. As they shook hands, Thomas's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, you're trending again. This time with Miller and the commissioner. What's happening? The story was growing beyond what any of them had anticipated. The next evening, Thomas sat in his living room with Lisa and their 2 children, watching news coverage of the developing story. Their son, Anthony, age 12, sat cross-legged on the floor, while their 9-year-old daughter, Zoe, leaned against her mother on the couch. Dad, they're talking about you again, Anthony said, pointing at the screen where Thomas's hospital photo appeared alongside images from the park incident. On screen, a reporter stood outside police headquarters. Sources tell us that Dr. Johnson met with both Officer Miller and Commissioner Walsh yesterday to discuss potential reforms in police training. This comes amid growing calls for accountability following the racially charged incident captured on video earlier this week. Zoe looked up at her father. Did you really meet with the police officer who was mean to you? Thomas nodded. I did. Why? She asked. He shouldn't have treated you that way. Thomas exchanged glances with Lisa before answering carefully. Sometimes, people make mistakes because they haven't learned better. And sometimes, if they're truly sorry, we can help them learn. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Lisa answered it to find Rachel standing on their porch with a folder in her hand. I'm sorry to intrude on your family time, she said when Thomas joined them at the door. But I thought you should see this before tomorrow's meeting. Thomas invited her in and examined the contents of the folder, statistics on police stops in the city, broken down by race and neighborhood, along with personal accounts from community members who had experienced similar treatment. Where did you get all this? He asked. I work for the Community Justice Project, Rachel explained. That's why I was at the park that day. We've been gathering data on incidents just like yours for the past 3 years. Thomas looked at her with new understanding. So when you stepped in, it wasn't just a neighbor helping a neighbor, she confirmed. Though that was part of it. We've been trying to get the police department's attention for years. Your case finally opened a door. Anthony had wandered over, curious about their visitor. Rachel smiled at him. Your dad is helping make some important changes, she told him. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Thomas and Lisa reviewed the materials Rachel had brought. These numbers are worse than I thought, Lisa said quietly. And these stories? Thomas nodded grimly. All these people experienced what I did, or worse, but didn't have a medical degree or connections to make people listen. Lisa squeezed his hand. But now they have you. You can make people listen. Thomas was silent for a moment. If I do this, work with the department on their training program, some people will say I'm selling out. That I'm helping them whitewash the problem. And others will say you're making real change from the inside, Lisa countered. You can't please everyone. It's not about pleasing people, Thomas said. It's about doing what's right. As they talked into the night, Thomas came to a decision. His meeting with the police department tomorrow would be different than what Commissioner Walsh was expecting. He had his own plan now, one that would ensure real accountability. The police headquarters conference room was packed tight. Commissioner Walsh sat at the head of the table, flanked by Captain Reynolds and other high-ranking officers. Officer Miller sat quietly in a corner, looking uncomfortable in his formal uniform. Representatives from the mayor's office occupied one side of the table, while members of the Community Justice Project sat opposite them. Thomas entered last, carrying a laptop and the folder Rachel had given him. A hush fell over the room as he took his place at the table. "Thank you all for coming," Commissioner Walsh began. "As you know, we're here to discuss a new training initiative following the unfortunate incident involving Dr. Johnson and Officer Miller." Thomas listened as Walsh outlined a proposal for sensitivity training, a series of lectures and workshops that would be mandatory for all officers. When Walsh finished, he turned to Thomas with a smile. "Dr. Johnson has generously agreed to participate in this program, sharing his personal experience to help our officers understand the impact of their actions." All eyes turned to Thomas, who opened his laptop and connected it to the projector. "Before I agree to anything," he said calmly, "I'd like to share something with you." The screen filled with a map of the city, covered in red dots clustered in specific neighborhoods. Each of these dots represents a complaint filed against your department for racial profiling over the past 5 years, Thomas explained. "As you can see, they're concentrated in predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods." The room grew tense. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. "Your proposed training program sounds impressive," Thomas continued, "but it doesn't address the real problem. This isn't about sensitivity, it's about accountability." He clicked to the next slide, a series of statistics showing how few complaints resulted in disciplinary action. Only 3% of these complaints led to any consequence for the officers involved, Thomas said. "That's not a training issue. That's a culture issue." Commissioner Walsh's smile had faded. "Dr. Johnson, we invited you here to collaborate, not to lecture us on how to run our department. And I came here to ensure that what happened to me doesn't happen to others," Thomas replied evenly. "The training program should be just one part of a comprehensive plan." He laid out his counter-proposal, an independent civilian review board with real authority, body cameras with strict protocols for use, and regular public reporting of stop data by race and neighborhood. "Officer Miller made a mistake," Thomas acknowledged, nodding toward the officer. "He's taken responsibility for it. But the system that allowed it to happen, that's encouraged it to happen, remains unchanged." There was a long silence after Thomas finished. Finally, a representative from the mayor's office spoke up. "These are reasonable requests, Commissioner. And they align with reforms other cities have implemented successfully." Captain Reynolds leaned forward. "Change is hard, but necessary. I support Dr. Johnson's proposals." All eyes turned to Walsh, whose face had reddened during Thomas's presentation. The commissioner was known for protecting his department from outside interference. But he was also a skilled politician who recognized when the tide was turning. "Let's take a short break," Walsh said, "and then discuss the details of these additional measures." As people filed out of the room, Miller approached Thomas. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For pushing for real change, not just window dressing." Thomas nodded, knowing the real work was just beginning. 2 weeks after the meeting at police headquarters, Thomas found himself addressing a crowd gathered in Washington Park, the same place where the incident with Officer Miller had occurred. A small stage had been set up near the playground, with chairs arranged on the grass for community members, police officers, and media. "This is where it all started," Thomas began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. "What happened to me here was not unique. It was just one example of something that occurs every day in our city, in cities across the country." In the front row sat Lisa and their children, alongside Rachel and other members of the Community Justice Project. Behind them, Commissioner Walsh and Captain Reynolds represented the police department. Officer Miller stood at the back, still on administrative leave but present for the announcement. Today, I'm proud to announce that the City Council has approved the formation of an independent civilian review board, Thomas continued. This board will have the authority to investigate complaints against officers and recommend appropriate action. Applause rippled through the crowd. Thomas waited for it to subside before continuing. Additionally, the police department has committed to implementing body cameras for all officers within 6 months, with clear guidelines for when they must be activated. And perhaps most importantly, the department will publish quarterly reports on all stops and arrests, broken down by race and neighborhood, which will be publicly available. Commissioner Walsh stepped up to the microphone next. He looked uncomfortable but resolute. These changes won't be easy, he admitted. They require us to re-examine how we've been doing things for a long time. But they're necessary if we want to build trust with the communities we serve. After the formal speeches, people mingled on the grass. A local news crew interviewed Rachel about the Community Justice Project's role in bringing about the reforms. We've been gathering data and stories for years, she explained. It took Dr. Johnson's case to finally break through, but this victory belongs to everyone who spoke up and refused to be silenced. Nearby, Anthony approached Officer Miller cautiously. "Are you the one who stopped my dad?" the boy asked. Miller nodded, kneeling down to meet Anthony's eye level. "I am. I made a mistake that day." "My dad says everyone makes mistakes," Anthony said. "He says what matters is learning from them." Miller smiled sadly. "Your dad is a wise man." Across the park, Thomas was deep in conversation with Captain Reynolds about the implementation details of the new policies when Lisa brought over a woman he didn't recognize. "Thomas, this is Officer Miller's mother," Lisa said. "She wanted to meet you." The older woman had Miller's same blue eyes, now brimming with tears. "I raised my son better than what he did that day," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm proud of how he's handled it since. And I'm grateful to you for giving him a chance to make it right." Thomas shook her hand warmly. "This was never about punishing your son. It was about making sure the next person doesn't have to go through what I did." As the sun began to set over the park, Thomas looked around at the unlikely coalition that had formed: community activists, police officers, city officials, and ordinary citizens. The work ahead would be challenging, but for the first time, he felt hopeful that real change was possible. What had started as a moment of injustice was transforming into a movement for justice. 6 months passed since the reforms were announced in Washington Park. On a crisp fall morning, Thomas arrived at the police academy to deliver his first official training session to a new class of recruits. The classroom fell silent as he entered, 24 young faces watching him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Good morning," Thomas began. "My name is Dr. Thomas Johnson. Some of you may recognize me from the news." A few recruits nodded. His story had become well known throughout the city and beyond. "I'm here today not as a victim or an activist, but as someone who believes you have the power to shape what policing looks like in our community." At the back of the room, Officer Miller, recently returned to active duty, stood alongside Captain Reynolds. Miller had been instrumental in developing the new training curriculum, drawing on his own experience to illustrate how unconscious bias could affect split-second decisions. Thomas shared his story with the recruits, not just about the incident in the park, but about his life experiences: being followed in stores as a teenager, being pulled over repeatedly when driving his luxury car, having patients assume he was an orderly rather than their doctor. "These experiences don't define me," he told them. "But they have shaped how I view the world. And how many in the community you'll be serving view the world." After Thomas finished speaking, Miller joined him at the front of the room. "What happened that day in the park was my failure," Miller told the recruits. "But the system failed too. We didn't have the right training, the right metrics, or the right accountability. That's changing now, and you're part of that change." Across town, Rachel sat in the newly established office of the Civilian Review Board, reviewing the first quarterly report on police stops. The data showed a modest but measurable decrease in racial disparities since the body camera policy had been implemented. "It's a start," she told the other board members. "But we have a long way to go." That evening, Thomas played basketball with Anthony in their driveway when a police cruiser slowed down as it passed their house. Thomas tensed instinctively, old habits hard to break. But the officer inside simply waved and continued on his patrol. "Dad," Anthony asked, noticing his father's reaction, "are things really different now?" Thomas bounced the ball thoughtfully. "Change takes time, son. We've taken some important steps, but this is a marathon, not a sprint." Later, as Thomas checked his email before bed, he found a message from an officer he'd never met. "Dr. Johnson, I was on patrol today and found myself about to stop someone for no real reason except they looked out of place. Then I remembered your training session last week. I drove on. Thank you for that." Lisa read the email over his shoulder and squeezed his hand. "One person at a time," she said softly. Thomas nodded. The incident in the park could have ended so differently, with anger, lawsuits, or nothing changing at all. Instead, it had become a catalyst for transformation, not just for Officer Miller or the police department, but for the entire community. As he turned out the light, Thomas reflected on how a moment of injustice had opened the door to justice for many. The work wasn't finished, it might never be, but they were moving in the right direction. 1 year to the day after the incident in Washington Park, Thomas returned to the same bench where Officer Miller had confronted him. The cherry trees were in bloom again, and children played on the swings just as they had that afternoon. Thomas unwrapped his sandwich and watched the ducks glide across the pond. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. Thomas looked up to see Officer Miller standing there, not in uniform but in casual clothes. "Please," Thomas said, gesturing to the space beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the park activity. "The department released the annual report yesterday," Miller finally said. "Complaints are down 30%. Stops and searches have decreased by almost half, but arrest rates for serious crimes haven't changed." Thomas nodded. "Rachel showed me the numbers. It's progress." "It's because of you," Miller said. "If you had just filed a complaint or sued the department, I'd probably be working security somewhere and nothing would have changed." Thomas shook his head. "It wasn't just me. Rachel and her team had been pushing for years. The community was ready. And you were willing to change, not everyone would have been." A young officer walked by on her patrol, nodding respectfully to both men. She wore a body camera prominently on her uniform. "You know," Miller said, "my sister's son is talking about becoming a police officer now. Before all this, I wouldn't have encouraged him. I was becoming too cynical about the job. Now, I think maybe he could be part of something better." Thomas smiled. "Anthony asked me last week if I thought he could be both a doctor and work on police reform someday. I told him he could do anything that matters to him." They finished their lunches as the afternoon sun warmed the park. As they stood to leave, a woman walking her dog recognized them and stopped. "Aren't you the doctor and the officer from the news?" she asked. "My brother is on the force in Chicago. He said they're looking at implementing the same changes you all made here." After she walked away, Thomas and Miller looked at each other with quiet satisfaction. 1 year ago, I never would have imagined we'd be here, Miller admitted. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes," Thomas replied. "If we're willing to do the hard work." As they walked out of the park together, no longer adversaries, not quite friends, but partners in an important cause, children continued to play, ducks swam in the pond, and the cherry blossoms drifted gently in the spring breeze. What had begun as an injustice had blossomed into something life-changing, not just for the two men, but for an entire community.